So I'm Barbara Ball. I'm the director at the Windsor Public Library, and I'm a member of the Vermont Sustainable Libraries Working Group. And we are very excited today to have Ham Gillette here, the program outreach coordinator at Greater Upper Valley and Southern Windsor County and Windham County Solid Waste Management Districts. Kat Moody, the community outreach coordinator at Chittenden Solid Waste District. And Ethan Hausman from Chittenden Solid Waste District will be fielding questions on the chat. Please direct any questions through the chat that will be answered on the Q&A. And please also check the previous questions on the chat to make sure yours hasn't already been asked. Enjoy the presentation.
All right. Hi, everyone. So today we will be talking about what happens to Vermont's recycling. And before we get started, I'm just going to give a brief overview of what we'll be going over. So we'll talk about where Vermont's trash goes, and then give a little intro to the materials recovery facility. And then we'll dive into the main part of the presentation, which will be going over different recyclable materials, where they go and what they become, and then talking about special recycling, and at the very end, some more resources for you all to take away from the presentation. And then we'll have a good chunk of time, maybe about 20 minutes or more for questions at the end. And again, you can pop your questions in the chat throughout the presentation. All right, so before we talk about what happens to Vermont's recycling, let's first talk about what happens to Vermont's trash. So Vermont has one landfill, which is located in Coventry, Vermont, up in the Northeast Kingdom, and it is owned and operated by Casella, and it manages about 75% of waste generated by Vermonters, and that remaining 25% will go to surrounding states like New Hampshire, New York, and Massachusetts, and will be managed there. And then if you haven't already heard the term materials recovery facility, or MRF for short, that is where your recyclables are first going, your blue bin recyclables in particular. In Vermont here, we have two MRFs. So one is located in Williston and the other is located in Rutland. And a MRF is a facility that receives, sorts, and bales your blue bin recyclable materials. And Casella is who finds our buyers for each of the materials that comes to our MRFs here in Vermont. And from there, they will go on their own journeys, which we'll touch on throughout this presentation.
Pat, may I just interject one thing here?
Absolutely.
I often direct people who call me or email me with questions about the MRF and where things go to, if you Google Casella MRF, MRF, or Casella Material Recovery Facility, you'll see a very instructive and fascinating, like 4-minute video of how that facility works. I think it's the videos of the one in West Rutland, but it's pretty fascinating, and it gives you a really good idea of what happens to your stuff once it gets dumped off the Casella truck. So that's it.
Perfect. Thank you, Ham. And yeah, you can see a few examples, some pictures in this slide of what sort of the behind the scenes looks like at the MRF. All right, so now we're going to dive into the journey of your recyclables. So where they go and what they become. And before we start, just a couple of disclaimers to keep in mind during the presentation. When I give examples of what each material becomes, just remember that these are just typical examples and do not cover all the product possibilities that each given material might become. And also remember that recycling markets are very dynamic. So where each material goes and what it becomes will shift and change because of the dynamic nature of recycling markets. So this information isn't set in stone, and it might change down the road, but this is accurate as of today. So our first material that we're touching on here is cardboard. So after cardboard comes to the MRF or either of the two MRFs in Vermont, it is then delivered to paper recycling mills either in New York or Canada. And then it goes through a recycling process at these mills where the cardboard is shredded. So it'll go through pulping machines where the cardboard is mixed with water and it's broken down into a paste. And at that stage, foreign materials are removed. So something like plastic or metal contaminants are removed. And then the paste moves through a couple of more stages where it's dried and pressed and worked into the right consistency. And ultimately, the next stage, chemicals will be added to give the paper more water resistance. And at this point, the mixture is about 90% water. And then it moves through a series of machines and rollers where the water is sucked out of the mixture and then consolidated and formed into thin sheets, sort of resembling paper at this stage. And then finally, it becomes cardboard boxes or cardboard medium, which is that squiggly liner between the box walls. And next up, we have mixed paper. So mixed paper goes through a similar recycling process as cardboard that I touched on in the last slide. But mixed paper from our MRFs will go to New York or various locations in New England or Quebec and becomes cardboard or pulp. And the next material here is aluminum. So the aluminum that we're talking about here is only the aluminum that's accepted in your blue bin. So that is sort of what you see in the picture here, like aluminum cans or trays, pans, balled aluminum foil that's bigger than that 2x2 inch rule. And aluminum is actually one of the most recycled and recyclable materials in use today due to a few factors. So it has a really high market value. And also there's a lot of efficient and accessible infrastructure that has been built to recycle aluminum, which makes it, more easily recyclable with all of that infrastructure already in place. And then it can also be recycled infinitely. Its properties hold steady no matter how many times it's recycled, unlike paper, which only has, a certain number of times it can be recycled. So from the MRFs in Vermont, aluminum will go to an aluminum processor in Alabama, and here it will go through a recycling process, which first is shredding the aluminum. And so the aluminum will be shredded, which helps remove any colored coatings like you see in the picture here. So it would remove color that you might see on a Coca-Cola can. And then that aluminum is melted down and into a liquid metal and then gets poured into molds, cooled with water, and then rolled into thin aluminum sheets to be used for new cans. All right, and here we're talking about steel. So again, steel that is accepted in your blue bin specifically, like soup cans. And after steel is sorted and baled at our MRFs here in Vermont, they will be transported to a smelting facility in Canada. And they'll go through a similar process of recycling as aluminum. But instead, the first step of this process is a detinning process. So steel is dipped into a chemical solution that dissolves that tin layer from the steel, because a lot of times soup cans or steel cans have tin and steel. And then the steel is melted down, just like we talked about with aluminum, and formed into large steel slabs that will ultimately be used in new products like metal parts for cars and electronics. And now let's talk about plastic. So in our material recovery facilities here in Vermont, plastics are separated by type of plastic. So the first type that we're talking about here is number 1 plastics, which includes things like water bottles or other drink bottles, salad dressing bottles, or peanut butter containers. And after plastic is sorted by type and baled at the MRF, they are taken to a plastic processor, either in Canada or various locations in the US. And once they're at this processing facility, they'll go through a few steps, the first being washing. So even though plastic is washed at this stage at the processing facility, it's still important to remember that, you know, you as the recycler still need to empty and rinse your own plastic containers before recycling, free of residue. And because if that doesn't happen, then they won't ultimately be baled and even make it to this plastic processor. And so the washing stage in this processing facility basically removes labels and adhesives, as well as any dirt or leftover residue on the plastic containers. And then the plastic is shredded and then goes through a separation process. So first they separate plastics based on density, and they do this with a float test. So, you know, the denser plastic shreds will sink to the bottom and the less dense ones will float to the top. And the shreds are also separated based on thickness. So this is determined through a wind tunnel test, and it'll cause the thinner pieces to float to the top and the larger, thicker pieces to stay at the bottom. And the final step of the plastic recycling process is that the shredded plastic is melted and crushed together to form plastic pellets, which are just a more usable form of plastic for the manufacturer. And then finally, number 1 plastics will ultimately become things like plastic bottles, fleece, or carpeting. And then moving on to number 2 plastics, these plastics include things like milk jugs, laundry detergent bottles, and shampoo bottles like you see in the picture here. And they will go to Alabama or Pennsylvania and become things like plastic bottles or drainage piping for road construction. And our last type of plastic here that we'll talk about, we went through number 1, number 2, and now number 5, which includes things like yogurt containers or margarine or butter containers. And these types of plastics will go from our MRFs here in Vermont to Alabama and become paint cans, just to give an example. And the last material that we'll talk about specific to the blue bin is glass. So this slide will address glass specifically from the Williston MRF, and then we'll talk about glass where that goes from the Rutland MRF in the next slide. So in Williston, the glass will go to a local quarry. And before I talk about what that process looks like, glass is actually one of the more difficult materials to recycle due to a number of factors, but basically it has a lower economic value, and CSWD actually has to pay to get rid of glass rather than the other way around that happens with other materials going out of our MRF. And the difficulty of recycling glass is complicated, but lower economic value. It's heavier and more expensive to transport, and it also has more, I guess, minimal end market uses. And so once it's transported from the MRF, the Williston MRF specifically, it will go to a local quarry and be processed into what's called a PGA, or processed glass aggregate, which is just a very fine sand-like material. And 1 to 2% of that glass aggregate is put into a hopper along with blasted rock from a quarry, from the local quarry, and those materials will be mixed together and then used in road construction. So that's the ultimate end use for glass coming from the Williston MRF. And then from the Rutland MRF, glass will go to Canada and become fiberglass and or other construction material. And now I'll pass it over to Ham to talk a little bit about the difference in collection streams.
Okay. Hi, everybody. There's just one slide for this, right, Kat? Is there just, I'm just working from this one slide.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, so in our planning sessions, when I was talking with Ethan and Kat, who have been instrumental in pulling this together, by the way, Ethan was referring to blue bin recycling, and I think I don't know about those of you. I'm talking to you from the Upper Valley, and those of you, I recognize some of your names in the attendance, but I always get I don't get confused, but I think there can be a confusion between what we call blue bin recycling, because not everybody puts out a blue bin, and also just mixed streams. So I know that many of you well, first of all, I'm assuming that in Chittenden County, which is the mother of all solid waste districts, that if you live in an urban or suburban setting, you oftentimes will have somebody like Casella or a smaller hauler come to your house and will pick up your trash and recycling. For those of us or those of you who live in a more rural situation, at the end of a dirt road, often that's not an option for you. And so you will take your recycling to a drop-off location, which is basically a transfer. So many of the solid waste the towns in the Greater Upper Valley Solid Waste District or the Southern Windsor Windham County Solid Waste District each town has your own separate transfer station. You call it a transfer station, recycling center, whatever. But and those are all open on a limited basis. I know some of you in our area also use the Hartford transfer station, and many of you are now using the Lebanon solid waste facility. So that's basically it. And I know I get a question a lot from people who use what we call a fast trash in this area, and there's a local hauler who runs those, and they throw your recyclables and your trash into the back of the truck, and it looks like it's all getting mixed together, but in fact that truck is retrofitted with a big solid metal partition that runs right down the middle of it. And it's also, if you look at that, there are two blades, and so if you throw your recyclables in one half of that truck, that blade will compact your recyclables in the recyclables half of the truck. You throw your trash bag in the other half, that blade will only crush your trash bags, and so they are sorted. Some people who get confused and think that single stream means, oh, I can throw all my trash and my recyclables in together. That is not the case. You have to always keep your trash separated from your recyclables. And I'm happy to answer questions if you want to put them in the chat, if I'm bringing up things that you don't understand. But so there are basically two pictures here of curbside versus drop off. You will also note that if you take your materials, if you get your materials picked up curbside, it's pretty likely that you are putting out all of your recyclables in one container. The generic term for that is single stream. Casella actually patented the term zero sort. So single stream and zero sort mean the same thing, but zero sort, Casella claims, can claim the name of zero sort. It's basically single stream what you're doing. If you take your recyclables to a drop-off location, transfer station, you will notice obviously that the transfer station asks you to sort your different materials. And that is because they get, depending on the market, they get paid more by the processor for a clean bin of cardboard, or a clean bin of mixed paper, or a clean bin of aluminum cans or whatever. So that's the deal there. And I think without even noticing it, I just explained mixed stream versus source separated. So I'm not a big, I'll just say that I'm not a big fan of single stream recycling, only because as many of you know, that's where we get into the contamination. I remember the days where you had to sort your brown glass bottles from your green glass bottles from your clear glass bottles. And now, mixed single stream recycling makes it easier for us all to recycle, and we don't have to have 12 bins under our kitchen counter. But it also allows us to not think quite so clearly what it is we're throwing out, and then you get that's what's causing a lot of contamination. There are European countries that have tried single stream and have now gone back to source separating because it just makes people pay attention. One of the questions that came into us via email was, how do we prevent contamination? Really hard question, but in general, we have a saying in the industry called, when in doubt, throw it out. So if you have any question at all, whether a material is recyclable, rather than saying, oh, I'm just going to throw it in here and someone else will take care of it, throw it in the trash. Because as soon as you put something that's not recyclable in your mixed recycling, your single stream, you contaminated that whole load of recycling. So it's a hard lesson to learn, but it's always much better to throw something in your trash can than second guess whether it's recyclable or not. I think that's, have I missed anything, Kat?
I think you covered it all. Thank you.
I could, if you want, run down respond to a couple of the questions that we got via email.
Yeah, we do have a quick section on special recycling.
Oh, okay.
And then,
yeah,
do you want to do that first?
Yeah, you do that.
Okay, great. Yeah, and then we'll dive into those questions. All right, so let's see. Moving on quickly from blue bin recycling and what Ham and I just talked about to special recycling. So special recycling is basically recycling programs for products that don't belong in your blue bin and should be separated and processed for recycling apart from blue bin recyclables. So those materials can be batteries, light bulbs, electronics, paint, and more that we'll dive into here. So the first item, batteries. Here in Vermont, we have most of the batteries will go to call to recycle, and you can drop batteries off at most drop-off centers or the environmental depot, just to name a few collection sites there. And then those will go to call to recycle, and the recycling process there looks like basically they remove different elements of the battery or separate different elements of the battery, like nickel, alkaline, lead, and lithium. And then those materials are recycled into different things. So there's a pretty long list of what they can become. But anything from silverware and golf clubs to new batteries or sunscreen, quite a long list. But those are important to, keep out of your blue bin and the landfill, because there's a really great program recycling them into these new products. And next we have electronics, which can be recycled as a special recyclable. And in Vermont, electronics will go to Good Point Recycling in Middlebury, and 10% of the electronics that they receive there get turned into refurbished electronics. And then the other percentage of those electronics that they receive will be disassembled, and then the materials will be recycled or reused in various ways. So those materials that they disassemble are, batteries, ink, plastics, and all of those will go through their own recycling process. And then light bulbs are another special recyclable item. And those will go to Veolia, which has 5 recycling facilities throughout the US. And you can see in the graphic on the right-hand side of the screen, the recycling process that light bulbs go through. And here we're specifically talking about fluorescent and CFL light bulbs. So they will be crushed, and then the materials will be separated out into different components, and those components will then be recycled into new light bulbs or electronics, and sort of closing that loop, as you can see in the graphic. All right, and latex paint is another special recyclable, and we have a really cool program at Chittenden Solid Waste that we call our local color program. And if you drop your paint off in Chittenden County at the environmental depot, the paint will go through a recycling process where you can see our local paint specialist Bob here is dumping usable good paint into a drum, and that paint will become new local color paint, which is sold at various locations around Chittenden County. And about 23% of the paint that we receive at Chittenden Solid Waste is recycled into local color paint. And then the other 30% is recycled in Canada. And then the remaining 47% becomes waste. And that 47% is paint that might have solidified or gone rancid or bad in some way that's just unusable. And another option for recycling latex paint is Paint Care, which is an organization that has drop-off sites in Vermont, and they recycle paint in a similar way, and about 77% of the paint that they receive gets recycled back into usable paint.
And that is what in the Upper Valley, in these 2 solid waste districts, that is our option. So if you drop off your paint at a hardware store or at a transfer station or at a hazardous waste collection, that paint is going to Paint Care.
Great. And then lastly, we'll talk about just the final example of special recycling, which is plastic bags and film. So obviously we're not seeing as many plastic bags with the plastic bag ban that in grocery stores, where you either bring your reusable bag or have the option to have a paper bag, but we definitely still see a lot of plastic bags and film from other sources. So these plastic bags can be recycled at most grocery stores in Vermont, as long as they're clean and dry. And an important difference there to make between types of plastic is if the plastic is stretchy, like the plastic bag in this picture, or saran wrap, those types of plastics are the plastics that can be recycled in grocery stores, versus something like a bag that's more crinkly, like something that like spinach will come in. Those cannot be recycled in this program that we're talking about. But most grocery stores will sell the plastic bags and film that they collect to a company called Trex, which then turns plastic bags into composite decking. And for reference, a 16-foot Trex board contains about 2,250 recycled plastic bags. So a pretty incredible amount of plastic bags that are being recycled and put to a more sustainable use. And finally, just some takeaways and what you can do. So I hope that after this presentation, you can see that your recyclables are being recycled, and you have some more tangible examples of what that looks like. I know that there are a lot of headlines and discourse going around about that make people skeptical about the recycling process, and that's understandable. It can be sort of a complicated process, and a lot of headlines can instill some cynicism in consumers, but hopefully that's been hopefully we've sort of helped answer some of those questions and clear the air a bit. Next takeaway is there are a lot of different ways to recycle. So not just blue bin, which is the type of recycling that we're most used to hearing and talking about, but also different special recycling programs like the plastic bag recycling program that we chatted about in the previous slide, or electronics recycling, and a lot of other take back programs or special recycling programs that we didn't even touch on, but pharmacies have take back programs oftentimes for your pill bottles. So just knowing that there's a lot of options out there. And then another thing that we hope you take away is avoiding contaminating the recycling. So sort of what Ham mentioned, we like to say, when in doubt, throw it out, because it can be pretty damaging to do so-called wishful recycling, which is when you're putting something in your blue bin in hopes of it making it to the recycling process, but in doing that, there's risk of contamination. And lastly, just making sustainable choices as a consumer. So being aware of a product's impact from purchase to disposal. Every product that you buy has to go somewhere, whether that's recycled into a new product or, thrown away in the landfill, or another option. But just knowing that everything that you purchase as a consumer has an end life. And then also buying products with minimal or recycled packaging is really important, because recycling is a loop. And if we're not sort of buying those recycled packaging items, then we're not closing the loop of recycling, which is really important. And lastly, recycling is very important, but it's not the end all be all. So we like to say, focus on reusing and reducing before you opt for recycling or throwing something away. And lastly, here are some resources that we'll send out in an email after this presentation. So I won't linger too much on this slide just so we have enough time for questions, but there are a lot of options to learn more about what we chatted about today, from scheduling a tour of the Williston or Rutland MRF, or diving into some of these videos and podcasts that we have linked here. And then also we have resources linked for finding different recycling locations for, plastic bags and films, or ways to recycle packaging materials like styrofoam. And now we'll open it up to questions, and Ham, Ethan, and I will all address some of the questions that you threw in the chat and continue to put in there. So we'll keep the chat open for the rest of the time and chat about some of these questions.
Okay.
Ham, if you
want to go ahead.
I was just going to suggest that I've tabled a couple questions to be answered now because I thought they lend themselves better to being answered out loud. And one of the ones that I was hoping that you would answer, Ham, is about aluminum cans being collected separately from pie plates and foil at a transfer station. We can certainly talk about that in terms of the MRF, but maybe you can address that for a transfer station and drop off.
Yeah, sure. In my experience, it depends on the town, it depends on the transfer station, and it depends on where those pie plates are going. If your materials are some transfer stations, I mean, I've seen containers where all aluminum cans, cat food cans, tuna fish cans, and pie plates all go together. And then I have seen others where they're separated. I would ask your transfer station, I mean, if you're taking it to a transfer station, I would ask your transfer station manager why they're being sorted and where they're ending up. I mean, not as a challenge to them, but just out of curiosity. That's that one.
Great, thank you. And for purposes of the MRF streams, they are not separated. So used beverage cans are sort of a category of aluminum that is considered very marketable. But at the MRF, aluminum pie plates and foil do get combined with the UBC, the used beverage containers, and they all go to aluminum processor together.
May I interject one quick thing about the Kat brought up the 2-inch rule, which is why if you want to recycle your bottle caps, keep them on the bottle. They will go through the system and they will not fall through the 2-inch grating on the conveyor belts. The same with if you're going to recycle aluminum foil, obviously clean it, rinse it as well as you can, and make sure that you put it in it doesn't have to be a tight ball, but make that ball at least 2 inches so that will not fall through the grating on the conveyor belt.
Yeah, and to add on to that too, if come springtime you want to take a tour of either of the material recovery facilities in Vermont, you can see examples of what it looks like when something smaller than that 2-inch by 2-inch rule comes through our facility. It will ultimately fall through the grate like Ham described and contaminate the glass. So if you come in person, there are some pretty eye-opening examples that you can see there.
Great. Can you, Kat, maybe talk about how plastics get separated at the MRF?
Yes. So they will first, and feel free to add anything to this, Ham and Ethan, but they'll first go through manual sorting processing. So people will be standing at a conveyor where about, if you can imagine a standard blue bin, 1.5 blue bins of recyclables are going past these people standing at the conveyor per second. And at this stage, people are pulling out the different plastic materials. One person might be assigned to picking out all of the laundry detergent bottles. Another person might be the water bottle person. So each person has a different material that they're picking out and then throwing into big containers on the other side of the conveyor. And that's how in the material recovery facility, we separate most of the plastics.
I don't have anything to add to that.
All right.
Here's sort of a bigger picture question we got about how would we respond to comments that it's worthless to separate recyclables because Casella or others just toss everything in the trash. Want to take a crack at that one?
Oh yeah, go for it.
All right. I'll just say that I think that we do like to point out that that tends to be a fallacy. That Casella, yes, owns Vermont's landfill, but they also own a lot of recycling facilities and organics facilities in this region, in the New England area. So they are heavily invested in recycling, and we know because we visited it regularly and offer public tours of it that the materials that are put in the recycling bins are getting sent to markets. And so we're addressing some of the misconceptions about what can go in the bin here. And stuff obviously it doesn't belong in the bin is likely to wind up in the trash. But the stuff that we say that we accept is going into, in most cases, into bales, and those bales are going to real facilities around the country. And there's not usually an economic incentive for people to be landfilling material because we try to make recycling less expensive than landfilling.
Okay. Just so Rachel Kahn, just so you know, I typed your answer regarding the hazardous waste collections in the Woodstock area.
Thanks, Sam. A question about whether Goodpoint, the electronics recycler, captures rare earth elements for reuse, for recycling. I guess I'll answer that and say that I can't speak, I don't think we can speak too well to Goodpoint's process, but certainly that is part of what they try to do. They try to refurbish electronics that can be refurbished and resold. They try to recycle as much of the components as possible. That is obviously sometimes challenging with how they're embedded in electronic devices and attached to plastic and things like that. But they do have systems for that, and often it's not happening at Goodpoint. It may be happening down a chain, but that is certainly part of the electronics recycling process.
And I'll just tag onto that, Franny, Enid's question about alkaline batteries into sunscreen. I don't want to know, and I don't know. So I would Google that, Franny, and or even contact Goodpoint. They're great people in Middlebury, and ask them that question directly. If you find out, please tell me.
I suspect it's the zinc that's being recycled.
Zinc.
Don't know any more than that.
Right. Okay.
Someone points out that if Vermont residents are using the Lebanon recycling facility, they may not be aware that none of the non-bottle number ones, PET, are accepted. So that's a difference between what we say we accept here in Vermont and what they say they're able to recycle in New Hampshire. Thank you for that note, Sarah.
And that's a big issue because many more people in the Upper Valley are using the Lebanon facility, and that, you know, it's great in some ways, but it's also obviously restricting what you can recycle because New Hampshire has limited recycling laws and special recycling laws. So something to keep in mind.
All right. Someone is asking us to, Joy is asking us to speak to Vermont's recycling laws. Someone want to go up for that?
Well, Joy, maybe you could make that a little bit more specific. I'd be happy to, rather than launching into the whole thing. If you could make that a little more specific, or even email me, I can address that.
And I'll switch to the next slide here just so people have our contact information up on the screen as we're answering questions.
I'm just going to fire away here. Or Ethan, do you want to take another one and then I'll take the one after that? Chuck Sherman, how can I encourage local store restaurants to not to use black plastic?
Sure. So I want to make clear that doggy bags in this case needs to be referring to rigid clamshells or other forms of takeout containers. True plastic bags of any kind are not going to be recyclable through the blue bin system and would only be a store take back option for recycling. I think that the gist of your question is how to, and the other thing I mention is that packaging baskets, that everything needs to be single use. So as long as we're talking about single use containers, rigid glass containers in both these cases, then it is worth encouraging restaurants or stores to be using items that can be recycled. And the best way to do that is to make it clear that you care and that you are their customer and that's important to you. We certainly try to make that case ourselves as in our course of our business outreach, but I think that it's a stronger message coming from you as the consumer and the customer.
And if you are allowed to bring your own container, do so.
Great point.
Carl Peterson, but the bottle caps are usually a different type. Yes, they are. And Ethan, you might be able to answer this better, but my understanding is that at the end of the process, those bottle caps are being removed from the bottle, and they are of a plastic that can be processed. Is that correct?
Yes, the caps there are a lot of caps that are arriving at the PET processors, and they can remarket those caps to people that specialize in the resins that the caps are. Next question. Can you recycle yogurt and smoothie containers without removing the plastic outer sleeve?
I would say that has to be removed. I just took a plastic sleeve off a glass bottle yesterday. Ethan, any thoughts on that?
That's a good question. We don't specify that. And, it sounds like this is probably talking about sort of a plastic film outer sleeve on plastic. And it's true that plastic sleeve is not like to be recycled. And so we certainly don't mind it being removed, but it's an example of where we don't want to ask more of you as the consumers. We want to make recycling easy. And we don't want to make the message too complicated. So we just tell you that smoothie, plastic smoothie cup or yogurt tub is recyclable as it is.
And adding on to that, in my own research, preparing for this presentation, there was, talking about the plastic recycling process. Ultimately, those plastic labels will be removed through the final stages of washing the plastics, and washing will include washing away the adhesives or labels. But yeah, like Ethan just said, those adhesives and labels won't be ultimately recycled with the plastics. They'll be treated as contaminants to be washed away.
We have a question about whether Casella, New Hampshire has different policies than Casella in Vermont on what can and can't go into its zero sort. And I don't have authoritative information about that, but I suspect they do because their MRFs have different capabilities. So they probably change their messaging from community to community based on the MRFs that serve that community.
Okay. Are we meeting our goals? Joy Gain. I would say we're working on it. I think there's just a report came out from the Vermont ANR that Vermonters are producing more waste than ever, and part of that I think is probably due to COVID. But I think we can all do better, and we all need to do better.
Somebody's mentioning compostable. Seems like we had great goals that aren't being met, and I think that is accurate in that compostables are viewed as a great solution to making things more divertible and avoiding some of the issues with having to be clean. That's an important part of things being recyclable. And when the realities for composting facilities is that compostables have their own challenges. And so in many cases, they are not the solution and are not any more sustainable than alternatives because they're not able to go to a composting facility.
I'm wondering whether Joy is talking about compostables, meaning compostable ware, or compostables as in food scraps. Got another one. Want to be more specific if you want, Joy. And I would say in my travels, I'm finding a lot of people who are individuals who have sort of temporarily thrown in the towel on sorting food scraps. Many of those are because they live out in the boondocks and the bears are just destroying their composters. But I would say contact your local solid waste district if you're frustrated. We can give you advice and help cheer you on, because it is a state law. I don't think it's going away, and there are very good reasons why we need to keep those food scraps out of our landfill.
And then I'll go ahead and answer one question briefly. Jennifer asked about thoughts on how libraries can help educate our communities about recycling beyond just flyers. And that is a good question. And if I'm not sure where you're located, Jennifer, but if you're in Chittenden County, feel free to reach out to me using the contact info in the slides. And we, Chittenden County and other solid waste districts in Vermont, offer workshops and presentations that we can host at your library. So that's a good option to help further educate communities in the area.
Thanks, Kat. Thank you for clarifying, Joy, and I'm sorry that I assumed incorrectly about compostables. You're right that food scraps, different answer than what I gave you about. I was talking about compostable ware, and we do have a ways to go on getting food scraps out of the landfill stream. But there's been a lot of progress made, and we are moving in the right direction. But point taken that we are not there yet.
And Ethan, I would add on to your response about compostables. I tell people to avoid them whenever possible. All they do is, I think there's a lot of greenwashing going on, and a lot of your compostables are not compostable. And depending on where you are and where you send them, they are being banned from composting situations. So.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Question about the seals or the rubber linings on metal jar lids. Those are generally not a problem for the metal processors, but it is worth noting that often those jar lids are best recycled as scrap metal, meaning not in the single stream or the blue bin stream. So ideally, small metal lids would be captured for scrap metal recycling and brought somewhere. Cartons are not recyclable here. If there was a photo that had of a milk carton, that is not something that we accept here in Vermont as recyclable.
Or ice cream containers. And that is because, Ethan, because that what a lot of people think is a wax coating is actually a plastic coating, correct?
That's right.
Yep.
What harm do food scraps do in the landfill? Very quickly, the issue there is the biggest issue is methane emissions. Methane being a really potent greenhouse gas. And if those food scraps are being composted instead, then there is some carbon dioxide that's generated in that process, but we'll take that trade-off because that is less potent as a greenhouse gas. Methane is very, very environmentally problematic.
And it's a material that can be used to regenerate soil, and it's taking up a lot of valuable space in the landfill, which is running out of space.
Right.
Sarah Riley, I just want to point out, this is kind of local to the Upper Valley, but everybody who knows about the Cover Home Repair store, they are greatly expanding their used book collection. So stay tuned for that.
Thank you. So we do accept paperback books in the blue bin, in the single stream. Hardcover books need to have their covers and spines removed if they're going to be recycled that way. Question about carton recycling and why some other states may allow cartons in the recycling. I think there's two possible explanations. One is that that's determined by the mills that buy the material. So some MRFs are working with buyers, mills that have the technology to be able to separate the plastic linings from the paper. It also sometimes may be that those cartons are not being recycled in those communities, that they are not, they are recognizing that they create confusion because they seem like they're paper. And so rather than spending a lot of communication bandwidth telling people they're not recyclable, they just accept them and then landfill them. So the explanation for the communities that accept them is probably one of those two explanations. And that looks like we have gotten to the bottom of the questions. So thank you everyone for a lot of good questions. And we are always happy to field questions in follow-up by email, as mentioned before. And I will turn it back over to others to wrap up.
Thanks, Ethan. I just want to not pigtail, that's not the right word. In terms of reaching out to your solid waste districts, we are there for you, and we are always will get an answer for you to any of your questions. So please take advantage of our resources and call us or email us. Kat.
All right. And I think that wraps it up. So thank you all for coming, and we will follow up with an email about resources and any other unanswered questions can be sent our way through our contact information, which we'll also send in a follow-up email after the presentation. So I think that's it. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their week. And thanks for joining us.
Barbara, did you want to pop in and say anything, or?
No, I'm just really excited that everyone came and I learned a lot. And thank you all so much for this presentation.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much.
Thanks for inviting us. Thanks, everyone.